Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LoCoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LoCoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, and we are back, and this week we are joined with Rick, who is Team LoCoFit's official licensed mental health consultant. Okay.
Good job.
We practiced this.
It's my official new title.
Many times. It was pretty frustrating and sad that I couldn't remember it. But if you guys listened to any of the last podcast, you just know that I'm an idiot when it comes to most things, let's be honest. So, really excited to do a two-part series on anxiety. I feel like most people here listening have some kind of anxiety in their life. They might be anxiety-prone people. And even if you weren't anxiety-prone before, this year has probably provoked a lot of anxiety within a lot of people. So I basically wanted to do a two-part thing. The first podcast is going to be more just kind of general information about what is anxiety, like how is it presented in your life. And then the second one, which will come out on Wednesday, is more coping strategies to deal with anxiety. So you have a whole list of notes. I'm very excited. So you can take it away. This is officially Rick's podcast. You came here all prepped, and I'm like, I'm not going to say shit besides your title, which I semi-jacked up, but I got it.
All right, so...
Also, everybody who's watching... We are officially back in the office, Woo-hoo. In the conference room. I was supposed to be doing that on the last round of podcast, but we royally messed that up. Oh, I did. So we are actually in here, and I'm so excited. And hopefully, if you're watching the video, you can see this cute background. And if you're not, I just hope that the sound is okay. And there we go. I just had to give my little... I'm just so happy. Like, literally, all of this was so exciting for me. And then...
I guess you could say not being in the office was causing me some anxiety.
Plenty of anxiety the past few months. Really good segue. So yeah, take it away.
Perfect. So yeah, when we were talking, Laurin really wanted me to come on and start to talk a little bit about anxiety. And so I feel like the best way to start this particular conversation is to normalize anxiety. And anxiety is normal. It is common, especially in today's society. This year, as you kind of hit on, gives us plenty of reasons to feel anxious. And I feel like it's important to recognize that, because I think sometimes people associate anxiety with having something wrong with them, or that they have some sort of disorder and it's worse than what they actually think it is. But anxiety is a normal, healthy emotion. And that kind of brings me to my second point, is that anxiety is an emotion. And it is one of a number of emotions. And what's really important to understand when we're talking about emotions and mental health and wellness is that our emotions exist for reasons. They're very specific reasons, but we don't get rid of emotions. A lot of times I hear people come into my office and they're saying, I don't want to be anxious, or I don't want to be angry, I don't want to be depressed. Well, good luck. I'm not the therapist for you. I can't cure you of those things. You're never going to get rid of that stuff. And so what I try and teach people is understanding emotions is learning to understand that all emotions are temporary. They only sustain for like a moment in time. And so what you're experiencing is brief. Now that can be happiness is brief, sadness is brief, depression, guilt, anxiety, euphoria, whatever it is. One of the kind of metaphors that I use is, remember back in gym class when you had to, sorry, I keep hitting the table and it shakes the camera. Back in gym class, gym teachers used to do this to us all the time. They used to make us line up in a line and run around the track. And then the person at the end of the line has to sprint ahead to the front of the line. And then once that person gets to the front of the line, then the person from the back keeps going up. And so this is kind of the race. And I use this as a way of describing our emotions. Like if you picture a long line of people running around a track, that's your emotional well-being, balance, your well-being. And so sometimes depression runs to the front of the line and it's present, and that's what's dominating that day, that race. But then eventually something else comes to the front, happiness or anxiety or something else. And so it's always this kind of revolving door, but nothing sustains. You have an even baseline, you experience something that brings you joy and happiness, and you feel that. And then eventually joy and happiness comes back down to normal. something terrible happens, your wife dies, your husband dies, you feel sad for a while, and then eventually you come back up to normal. And so what I try and help people understand is that all emotions are temporary, and that understanding that this is a moment in time is that it will pass. How do we get to help people so that it'll pass a little bit sooner? We're definitely going to get to that.
And to that, I just want to say, I think it's probably unhelpful when people say things like, oh, I don't want to be anxious, or I don't want to have I don't want to feel depressed. And it's like, there's obviously going to be layers to that, right? Like being clinically depressed, like those are things that you can work on, but oscillating between like depressive thoughts and like going through certain situations, like you're never going to not have that. Or it's like the thing, oh, I don't want to feel stressed anymore. And you're like, okay, well, that's not possible. And it's actually harmful to think that way, because then you're never going to be able to cope with it, because you're always looking at it as a negative thing. Right?
Yeah, you can't get rid of it. It's a part of who you are. There's no way around that. So yeah, if you're trying to eliminate sadness from your life, good luck. Things are going to happen that are going to make you sad. Things are going to happen that are going to make you anxious. And guess what? That's totally normal. It should make you anxious. It should make you sad. And I think the problem with where a lot of people are coming from today is there's this quick push to get rid of it all. And the second I feel sad, instead of learning how to cope with sadness, I just want to not deal with sadness and push it out of my life. And yeah, you said like clinically depressed. I remember back in graduate school, one of my professors, shout out to Dr. Amy Mena, I remember her starting one of our classes, and it was like our substance abuse class, and she's like, how many of you guys want to treat depression? You know, and like all the class raised their hand, and she's like, how many of you want to go through these personality disorders, and how many of you want to deal with PTSD and all this kind of stuff? And everybody's raising their hand because they're future heroes. And then she's like, so how many of you want to deal with like substance abuse? And like two of us raised our hands. We're like, yeah, we do. Like, we find that fascinating. And she's like, all right, so I've got a news flash for you. There's no way you can deal with depression and stress and anxiety and family relationships without knowing substance abuse. They're all interconnected. So depression, anxiety, substance abuse. When we're talking about anxiety, we're also talking about those things, because that's how people cope. Somebody feels anxious in today's society, so the first thing they want to do is run out and go get their green card so they can smoke weed and not feel anxious, rather than learning to deal with it and cope with it. So yeah, we don't get rid of emotions, we just learn how to manage them. And I find as a therapist now, what I'm actually teaching people to do is just to learn how to cope with their problems. That earlier generations, it was kind of this innate parenting thing, and we'll get to that when we start to talk about treatment methods. Mm-hmm. So let's start with defining anxiety. Like, what is it? So kind of a clinical definition would be excessive worry about various events. So what does that look like? What does that mean? And how does it really present? So people who are struggling with anxiety, what you'll see is they oftentimes feel restless, they have fatigue, they have difficulty concentrating, intense irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbance. Like, that's pretty typical. How many of your
poster
clients?
child for anxiety. Okay, perfect.
So
this is really a free therapy session, guys. That's what I was really trying to get out of it. We thought we'd record it.
Yeah. So what are causes of anxiety? Like, how is it I can look at something and know that this is anxiety producing? And so there are really basic categories that we can fall into: physical health, child welfare, financial status and well-being, civil unrest. Like, these are all huge things that will and are causing anxiety. And I think part of the issue is that people are trying to just turn off this anxiety part. And it's like, you can't do that. It's learning to deal and be present in these situations and understand what the anxiety is actually teaching you and telling you, and how to manage through it. Other things that people get anxious about: marriage, your neighborhood, your friends, your family. One of the things that I had to learn how to reconcile early in my career was, and I've used this analogy before, one person's ceiling is another person's floor. So what is anxious to you may not be anxious to me. And I remember sitting with some of my clients and they're telling me about what is making them anxious. And I'm like, that's nothing to be anxious about. That's just ridiculous. But that's my perception, and that's my views on the client's problems. And I had to learn to really push that aside. And I'm telling you this because for your clients that are listening to this podcast, excuse me, when people are telling you what is making them anxious, I'm encouraging you not to judge them through that process, to not minimize it, to not be like, well, this is stupid, or to take the opposite approach, to not blow it out of proportion for them. Like, oh my God, you're not bothered by this? Like, so now you're projecting your own thoughts, your own feelings. This level of transference is starting to occur where now you have to raise to my expectation rather than me trying to understand it on your level. And that's a big difference. So one of the other points that I want to make right here is there's a difference between somebody who's struggling with anxiety, like an event that's coming up or an experience that happened, versus a person who has an anxiety disorder. I don't want to dive into all the different types of anxiety disorders, but what's a good way to distinguish between the disorder versus a person who's just experiencing something that's making them anxious? Let's go back to that other podcast. Is it causing clinically significant impairment in the following areas? Meaning, are you experiencing problems in your relationships? Are you experiencing problems at work? Is the stress or the anxiety really impacting your health? If we can look at it in those ways, if you're not working and you're in school, like, are you struggling to make assignments and make grades? Are you and your wife arguing, your husband arguing? Are you not communicating effectively? Physically, are you becoming more sick? Are you having difficulty sleeping? Even though certain experiences and things, like for example, if I'm preparing for a competition, right? And I know that the competition is 6 months out. I'm not really nervous right now, am I? But as the competition grows, might I become more irritable? Might I have difficulty concentrating? Would my sleep patterns be disrupted, right? You tell me, are those kind of common things for competitors?
Incredibly common. Also, there's the physiological stuff that's going on, but even just take that away, just the prep kind of, or any kind of competition creates this, like, what I always call like low grade anxiety. And when people are kind of explaining that to me, I'm like, yeah, this is part of that process. You know what I mean? Like, there's physiological things going on. If somebody's getting ready for, let's say, like a physique competition, there's a lot of physiological things going on, but also psychologically, like, this event is getting closer and like this is becoming very real. And like, you're going to be either going out on the stage, on the platform, like whatever you're doing, and this is becoming a real thing, not just like a bucket list thing that you wanted to, you said like 6 months ago, like, oh, hey, I'm going to go do this. So it's super common for people to feel that way. And I think one of the best things you said was talking about like the projecting your own feelings, or you're projecting your feelings into like your responses. And that's something that I had to learn as a coach, because everybody, basically I always feel like I just manage personalities. You know, like that's like a huge part of coaching and obviously therapy too, because everybody's going to come to you with this different baseline of just their own personality type and like how they respond to things. And it's so interesting, like instead of just saying like, hey, here's like there's so many reasons that like a one size fits all approach is terrible for coaching, but particularly for communication, because for one client it might be like, hey, like, you know, we're taking the smallest win and we're really like celebrating that. Whereas for somebody else, like they might be like, okay, fuck off, I don't need to hear that. Like they need some other kind of feedback, or they need like some other kind of direct response, right? Like it's just how you respond to people. It's so interesting, but that's really the most important thing. And you know, with coaching, we end up, it almost becomes like semi-life coaching, and that term has become like super bastardized, but like, yes, I'm a nutrition and training and mindset coach, but like a lot of their life is in that, you know what I mean? Their life affects all of those things. So like I hear a lot about people's lives. So you have to learn how to moderate, not like what you would perceive the situation as, because also it's like, it's the perception, like you're reading their perception. So there's already like layers of perception there. So I can't add my layer of that to it either and like make it even more convoluted. So say, gotta detach from this. I'm not thinking about like my past experiences with anything like this. I just have to like actually respond and give them the best answer. But that's like a skill to develop, instead of just being like, whatever, like brushing something off or blowing it out of proportion. Like, holy shit, I would never let somebody say that to me. And then the person's like, okay, like, wasn't really a big deal. I just threw it in there. Yeah,
and we're seeing a lot of that in society with the more bigger issues that are happening right now, where people want you to feel what they're feeling. They want you on their level, and if you're not, you're almost considered the enemy. So even like conversations can be anxiety producing. But there is a difference between a person who is just having a normal experience where anxiety is typical and normal versus a person who's suffering from more of an anxiety-based disorder. You know, so 6 months out, you're not going to be nervous, but 4 weeks out, 3 weeks out, you know, 2 or 3 days before the competition, the day of, you're going to be doing things that are, you know, you're going to see these symptoms kind of manifest, and that's typical and it's normal. It is common. Like, anxiety exists for a reason. Mostly it's to warn us of danger, and we're going to get to that. But these emotions serve roles.
What would an anxiety disorder, like, where would that kind of line be drawn instead of like, hey, you're having some anxiety versus like more of a disorder-based issue?
Well, like I said, part of it is starting to evaluate, through that criteria. Like if I'm looking at it from that social, occupational, physical, financial, relationship type
and if it's
scope.
more like chronic.
Yeah, and then I'm also going to start looking at the length and duration. And then what type of anxiety is the person experiencing? Are we talking about, separation anxiety? Are we talking about panic disorders? Are we talking about social phobias? So there's a wide spectrum. So that's why it's kind of like when we do the podcast where we say, hey, you guys send in your mental health questions, I'll be glad to answer any of those questions
We'll be doing one of those
in detail. But to talk about like separation anxiety, we could fill up hours.
Yeah.
So
it's more of a chronic thing. Is basically.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, if it's a specific event, you can really trace the anxiety to that event. That's pretty typical, pretty normal. Like a death, a loss of a job.
Happening in the world
yeah,
right
something
now.
is happening. Like
coronavirus.
Yeah.
People are anxious.
And for good reason, right?
Yeah.
Like your financial situation is threatened, your family's health is threatened, your children, like there's so many things that are happening. Your future is unknown. And this is another part that we're going to get to. Like anxiety is a future-based system. It is dealing with the unknown and anything that is in the future. So if you don't understand it and it's unknown and it's going to happen in the future, you could bet there's probably going to be some anxiety around it.
Yeah.
So
like my worst nightmare. We're talking about it.
Here it is. So I do want to talk about what happens in the body and how anxiety is really created. And I don't want to go down this whole like neurological path, this wormhole and get into the neuroscience part of it. But I do want to talk about the human brain and how anxiety kind of manifests itself in not two sections of our brain, but there's one section of our brain where we call it the neocortex. It's part of the cerebral cortex. But this is the part of the brain that's responsible for higher functioning, right? This is spatial reasoning, it's language, it's movement. You're listening to this podcast, you're engaging in a conversation. So right now, the neocortex part of your brain is dominating. When you're balancing your checkbook, you're driving. These are the kinds of activities and tasks that part of the brain is responsible for. We have another part of our brain called the limbic system. And the limbic system has multiple components to it. It's also been referred to as like our animalistic brain. This is the instinctual part of it. Now there's multiple purposes that the limbic system holds and serves, okay? So we're not gonna dive into that, but what I do wanna talk about is one of the most important components of the limbic system is emotional response to stimulation and the fight, flight, and freeze responses. Because this is the part of the brain where it's stored. So why is it important to understand these two different parts of the brain and this dynamic that exists? Well, when people feel anxious, they're perceiving this experience, this person, whatever it is, as a threat. It's dangerous, it's unsafe. And so when that threat to your own life starts to occur, the neocortex slowly fades down and the limbic system fires up. Why? Because now it's time to keep ourselves safe. And fight, flight, or freeze are different responses that people will have to different triggers. And you can vacillate between all three. Somebody walking up to you on the street in a dark alley may trigger your fight response. Somebody questioning you about where you were or what you were doing or something like that may trigger a freeze response where you're like, I don't know what to do, and my body just shuts down and I can't move and I can't talk. Now the limbic system is really taking control, and that's what's dominating. So it's important to understand those things. And so to get clients who are struggling with anxiety, one of the things we want to do is really process through what their fears are so that we can get them to start approaching it from not a fear-based perspective, but like, how do we start to incorporate a little bit more logic, a little bit more reason, and bring this back down to earth?
I feel like the emotional side of things is what amplifies this, right? And then you basically, like, you have this anxiety and then people just get so overwhelmed. I find that's a really common thing that I see with clients. And when they get anxious and they get overwhelmed, then they just make poor decisions. And
Yes.
not just clients, like myself too, like I think everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's identifying actually like what are those triggers, like what are those fears, like what was the reason you had this. Don't just tell me you're anxious, don't just tell me that you're overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
We actually need to get to the root of this, otherwise we're literally going to be spinning in circles every single week.
Exactly.
And that's one of it's a hard thing to have, or like even when people have like failed previously with something, right? Like say like you're trying to develop a new habit or a new skill or some kind of diet or huge goal, and they fail. And then we say, hey, you need to sit down and actually figure out and put into words what went wrong.
Yes.
Like I can tell you what I think went wrong, but I need you to put into words what actually went wrong, and you need to tell me those things without me. Then I can add, my input from like an outsider perspective, but I need to hear that first. And that's really uncomfortable for people, but that's really where we kind of see like, where were these holes? Like where do we need to fix the issues? And without that, it's really hard for people, I found, to ever make really any progress with kind of any goal, health related, mental health related.
Sure, and by making the client say that, you're creating the awareness within them versus you telling it to them, where it's very easy to dismiss it and block it off. So yeah, you have to start processing it. There's a theory, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, Linehan's theory, and one of the things that she talks about is she uses this triangle, and the lower right-hand corner is what we call emotional reason, or the emotional mind. And it's all of our emotions are in there, and that's when we're thinking and making our decisions based out of the emotional mind. Then there's another part of that thought process where she calls it the reasoning mind. And so the reasoning mind is almost the exact opposite of the emotional. This is just nothing but thought and logic, and it's like 1 + 1 = 2, and what's the best way to work and most efficient. And then at the top of the pyramid is what we call the wise mind. Now the wise mind obviously takes into consideration all of that. It takes in the emotional context as well as the reasoning context, because there are certain decisions that yes, you can make using just your reasoning mind. And yes, there are certain times when just the emotional mind is okay. But when you're trying to make sense of something, what the wise mind does, and what it does for me as a therapist, is it's like, okay, this reminds me not to ignore the emotional response, but to process the emotional response and allow the logic and reason to help create solutions for it. So it's that perfect marriage and harmony of both. And that's why we call it the wise mind, is because it's truly the more efficient and better way to deal with whatever the situation is or that problem. So now that we kind of know what's going on in the fight, flight, or freeze, we know where it's coming from when our mind is triggered into this space. This is very, very common with trauma. So when we're talking about anxiety situations often produce trauma-like responses in people. And again, we don't need to dive down through the whole nervous system and what's really happening in that. But what is important to understand is, what is the response that I'm having? Why am I maybe particularly having this response? I guess it's a question you can start to ask yourself. It doesn't really matter to me. It's just what I identify as that you're reacting in an unhealthy way, or a way that was designed to keep you safe and protect you. And now it's time for us to kind of work backwards and go through this and figure out a way to process it so that we're not always afraid, so that we're not just stuck in not experiencing life anymore because our own anxiety is preventing it. Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. And that's where I would say that the small anxiety issues, right, or the small fears people have, when they do continue to build up, that's when we start to see all those really negative patterns. Or at least from, again, my coaching perspective, if somebody has anxiety around something, let's say as simple as not knowing what's in their food, which to a lot of people might sound, okay, that's ridiculous, but for some people that's a very real thing they experience. So if they don't make it or they don't weigh it, they're unable to feel like they can eat it. And this becomes a huge issue. And a lot of times the types of diets that people have followed in the past, or the types of disordered patterns that they've used, are just simply a control mechanism. And a lot of people with eating disorders, disordered eating, control issues, it all comes back to this, right? And they do not know how to handle things when they're kind of outside of their bubble, and that's very anxiety provoking. But then what ends up happening is people literally cannot eat anything that they know. It slowly, gradually, it's kind of the agoraphobia. At some point, you just don't leave your house anymore, right? There's these small steps to people not leaving. Oh, hey, I won't go here, and now I don't feel like going here again, and I don't feel safe here, and then eventually they don't leave their house. It's the same thing with anxiety around food. People basically start with these small habits, and then eventually it's if I didn't make it and I didn't weigh it, I'm not going to eat it. So that takes away all social situations. It takes away literally going out to eat, going to parties, like family stuff. Like you want to go to have a dinner with your significant other, you can't go do that anymore. And it becomes a huge issue.
Now, what you're describing is when we're talking about clinically significant impairment, now we're seeing that come to life. That's a real contextual example. It's like, how do I know when I have a problem? Well, did you just listen to that? Is that you? It's probably causing some problems, right? Does this mean you're like a psychopath? No, it just means that you...
There's another step before that part, okay? We're not going to talk about that, but...
It just means that it's reached a point where it's not just an inconvenience, it's not something that one other person has recognized as a problem, it's legitimately causing problems in your life.
Yeah. Whether you think it is or not.
Right, the parts of your life that cause harmony and balance.
A lot of these people don't think that it's a problem, and it is a problem, and it's really hard to tell people who are entrenched in something like any kind of disorder, hey, like this is a problem, where you're like, no, I've told myself a million times that this is normal and this is okay, and I don't want to change. So that's where it becomes really challenging as a coach, and that's where things like therapy become so important, because it's like, listen, like
breaking a person out of denial is always one of the more difficult tasks that a therapist has. You know, you can literally be showing a person like example after example, proof after piece of proof, like, do you see how this is deteriorating your life? Like, these are the words your wife said. These are the things your husband said. Your kids don't want to talk to you. Like, you don't have a job anymore. It's a problem. You can't, no, it's not. I'm totally in control, or I've got it handled, or no, they don't understand me. And so there's all these excuses and different rationalizations that start to come into place. But yeah, I mean, breaking a person out of a state of denial is always a difficult task. And ask any therapist who's worked with clients, and they'll probably tell you, when people are in denial, it's just a really difficult step, and you have to start learning to kind of push people through that. So we'll just kind of touch on when a person's in fight, flight, or freeze. Your heart rate increases, it's beating faster. For some people, their heart rate decreases, depending on the response that they're having. If you're going to freeze, it might be really slow. Your lungs, your breathing speeds up, delivering more oxygen to your blood. However, if you're in a freeze pattern, your breathing might be more shallow, and you're not thinking, you're not delivering oxygen to the rest of your body. Your eyes can become more dilated, allowing light to kind of travel in and observe things quicker. This is, kind of that, like, again, you're in survival mode. Hearing oftentimes can perk up, consider it like sharpened hearing. Your skin can oftentimes look cold and pale. Blood can drain from the extremities. Your hands and feet can oftentimes be very cold and sweaty and clammy. And your pain perception for some people can really decrease. People who are experiencing fight, flight, or freeze oftentimes don't notice that they're in a lot of pain, or things don't hurt until they're done. I remember watching a UFC fight where the fight ended in the first round. And it was like in the interview after the fight was occurring, like the round had just ended, the guy had won, and they were interviewing him about it. The camera, the announcer was like, hey, look at your toes. And the guy's toes were totally broken and mangled, and the bones were sticking out. And it was the first time he looked down, and he was like, oh my God, that's bad. And he didn't recognize it because the adrenaline was pumping, because in that moment, he was literally in a fight. So he was in a fight, flight, or freeze kind of a state where his adrenaline was pumping. He didn't feel pain. I guarantee you about 20 minutes later, the pain started to come.
Oh shit.
Yeah, my toes are broken and sticking up instead of down.
That is such a terrible visual. I also have PTSD from toe issues, clearly, from what's happening. I won't share those details with you guys, but jiu-jitsu is not the best sport. Let's just say that. Especially the best sport for keeping your body together.
Yes. So to kind of wrap up this part of the podcast before we start really getting into treatment, for most people, when they're experiencing some sort of panic-induced or anxiety-induced moment or experience, generally once the stimulation or the stressor is removed, give yourself about 20 to 30 minutes for your body to kind of return back to its normal baseline. Again, how you're going to respond to a specific situation is going to depend on what your first experience with it was, how it was kind of managed or you were taught to manage it, and then, how you can change that as an adult. And it can change. A perfect example of that is like the military. The military trains people to take situations where normal fight, flight, and freeze responses are utilized, and they like literally train that out of them because they need them to be able to operate in stressful situations. So if the United States military can do it, you certainly can too. And we're going to get into some of the concepts on how to kind of conceptualize stress and anxiety, next. So again, when you're faced with a perceived threat, your brain interprets that as danger, and that the situation is life-threatening. It's definitely going to create higher levels of stress. You'll see fight, flight, or freeze kick in. And if it's not a life-threatening situation, a lot of times what you'll see are those kind of signs and symptoms that we talked about before: difficulty concentrating, irritability, fear, excessive fear or worry that you really can't control. So you'll see those symptoms manifest when anxiety is starting to develop in a person. So being aware of those symptoms is kind of the first step in knowing whether you're experiencing something with anxiety versus depression, etc. So,
and I think just to kind of loop it back to the beginning, anxiety is normal, and it should be something that's normalized. It shouldn't be something that we're trying to eradicate. And I think that even if you are like a more anxiety prone person, which obviously there's certain people who are, learning how to manage that instead of thinking like this is just going to go away, and like,
yes,
that's just it's such a self-defeating thing to say. And I feel like that's where people don't ever get better, you know what I mean? Because you're like, oh, well, this is how I'm wired and I can't manage it, or I can't change anything.
Those are excuses, and a lot of times they're in a state of avoidance. They don't want to deal with it, is what I'm hearing. So it's just easy to be like, oh, it'll go away. It came naturally, it'll go naturally. Okay. Like, it's just your way of kind of avoiding dealing with what the real situation is, and that maybe you don't know how to deal with it, and that's fine. Maybe you're not prepared to deal with it. You don't feel like the environment is safe enough for you to deal with. There's a lot of different reasons you can go on and on with that, but yeah, I mean, people will come up with excuses to not deal with it. So definitely it is normal. Don't be ashamed of it. And like I said, there's going to be some certain times and places where you're going to feel completely confident and not have any anxiety, but the person sitting next to you will be sweating profusely. They'll be ready to vomit. They'll be like, they can't sleep for days. Even when you ask them simple questions, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, just like that. Just like the very first podcast we ever did. If you want to see an anxiety attack, just go back and watch the first podcast we ever did on what is psychotherapy, and you'll get a real kick out of it.
Episode 53, in case you're wondering.
Timestamp. Just actually, if you do watch the video, you can very clearly see when I start going downhill. It's a very rapid.
Do you remember the time? I think
no,
Ryan found it, didn't he? Didn't Ryan find it? All right.
Of course. Such a dick. All right. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, as always. If you have any other questions, please let us know. You can go to the contact on our site, teamlocofit.com. And we will be doing a podcast at some point. I think it's just like a general mental health Q&A, I guess.
Cool.
Some kind of question. So you can send those questions to that email address, or we will definitely I will post about that beforehand. So thank you guys so much, and we'll catch you next time.